Well, I'm late to the party on this one. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you. You've heard plenty about it. Uh, Elon has made his bid for Twitter. It was something like 43 billion. I think he offered like 54.60 a share. He currently owns like 9.2% or something like that. So he wanted to buy the other 91-ish percent. It's all or nothing bid to the board. It is a good offer. I mean, it's way above market value. When Elon started buying Twitter, which has driven Twitter stock up, substantially, it was somewhere around like $38 a share. And so I believe that his offer is something in the neighborhood of 38% above. Or maybe I'm getting that figure wrong. Anyway, it went from like $38 and now he's bidding like $54, $56, something around that, in the 50s, $53 maybe. Substantially more than Twitter was worth before he got involved with all this. And so he's giving them a great deal. I mean, this is a massive return. If you could have bought Twitter stock in like December and sold it to Elon at $56 a share, you'd be doing pretty good. And all of the Twitter, owners, if they look at it purely as an investment and not as an ideological pursuit, well, they should be very happy. But we've gotten an answer from at least one major Twitter shareholder, and that is Prince Alawid of Saudi Arabia, who I believe is also a major shareholder in News Corp. I remember him in stories about Fox News and the Murdochs in the past. I'm pretty sure Prince Alawid is also involved with that. So this is a guy who invests in media. And probably because he wants to control the narrative, being a Saudi prince and tied to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Again, another great pillar of democracy that is in lockstep with the neoliberal left. Prince Alawid, the monarchist who executes gays and won't let women drive their own car, unless under specific circumstances. I guess they're slightly opening up the driving and crap like that, but I don't need to make the case that Saudi Arabia is an unfree, wildly illiberal country. The word liberalism is just comes nowhere near Saudi Arabia. The word has no meaning in Saudi Arabia because it's just not even a topic of conversation. Yet, liberals in the United States and the West more broadly are relying now on Prince Alawid to defend their values. Because, of course, Musk and the Musk bros who support him, they're all white supremacist neo-Nazi Trumpers. Now, the other people, so did I say Prince Alawid? I talked a lot. Did I say he's rejecting the offer? He doesn't think, he thinks, it's not worth it. It's still worth more to him, which, by the way, is his right. I mean, as an individual, the price of anything that you own, what a fair price is to sell it at, that's up to you. A fair price is whatever price you're willing to sell whatever it is you own for. When the government comes in and they, declare, oh my gosh, eminent domain. I can't believe I forgot that term for a minute. They come in and declare eminent domain, and they offer you fair market value for your property. They say, get out of your house. I don't care if your grandfather built this house and your family's lived here for 3 generations. We want to build a hotel because they're going to pay more in property taxes. The government comes in and does that. It's not a fair market price. The fair market price is whatever you would have willingly sold it at. It's by definition not a fair market price because they're putting a gun to your head. They're saying get out or we're going to kill you. Essentially, that's what happens. If they declare eminent domain and you don't leave your house, they're going to eventually you get to the stage where they just send the police in to kill you. Now, in modern times, I don't think there's anybody who has taken it that far when they've eventually been told to vacate the property because they lost in court, in the Supreme Court even. I believe it was the Kelo case. She eventually got out. She just left. But if she had stayed there, she would have been declared a trespasser, and they would have invaded her home, sent the police, and if she defended herself, And, because those police were invading her home, they were home invaders. If she defended herself, they would have killed her. And so I don't want to say that, Prince Alaweed should be forced to sell his shares. Far from it. It's the same principle applies here. If he doesn't feel like Elon's offer is worth it to him, that his shares to him are worth more than $54 or whatever it is Elon is offering, that is perfectly fair. But we all know that the reason why Prince Alaweed doesn't want to sell his shares is because he doesn't want Elon Musk taking that power away that he has over Twitter. If you if you have a hand in controlling Twitter, you have a hand in controlling the narrative across the globe, but certainly across the West. And I'm sure that Prince Alaweed has leveraged his influence for the sake of his kingdom. His leverage over Twitter, his leverage over Fox News, in order to preserve the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's image. And the Saudis have worked, I put worked, sort of in air quotes, very hard over the decades and, now well over a century, to build up their reputation and to try to distinguish themselves and control international opinion about them. And so the Sauds don't want to give up any influence that they've been able to amass. They're trying to gain more influence in the West and in the world more broadly. They don't want to lose influence, and that's what they'd be doing. I mean, sure, they would get money, but the Sauds have plenty of cash lying around. They don't need Elon Musk's money. So that's what I have to say about Prince Alaweed. Now let's look at everybody else. Let's look specifically at the big three asset managers. Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock. I believe their assets under management go in that order. Vanguard, I believe, is the biggest, State Street second, and then BlackRock third. These firms manage a whole variety of funds, but most notably index funds. Vanguard invented the index fund, and the idea of an index fund, for those of you who are not familiar with the stock market, when you see those three numbers on the evening news when they say, Dow Jones, S&P, and NASDAQ, those are the indexes. The index is made up of, in the case of the Dow 30 stocks, the S&P 500 stocks, and the NASDAQ typically, there's the NASDAQ 100, the NASDAQ Composite. I believe most index funds are just the NASDAQ 100, which are the 100 biggest stocks listed on the NASDAQ exchange. And so in the index fund, you own the whole index. You own, little bits of each one of those companies in proportion to their size within the index. And then that gets into weightings, and I don't want to get too complicated in the weeds about index weightings, but it is somewhat important for some news that broke just a couple hours ago about Vanguard and Twitter. So briefly, we'll take the S&P, for example. The S&P is an index that is weighted by market cap. What does that mean? It means that the index is an amalgamation. It's a composite number to represent the value of all the stocks in the index. And each stock's price, each stock's value, I should say, has a different, makes up a different portion of the index, I'll put it that way. Some stocks are very, very, their price and their market cap is very, very influential and very, very important to the index, and others don't matter as much when they fluctuate within a day. So, for example, companies like Tesla or Apple or Amazon that are very, very big, if they move in a day, let's say 5%, that's going to have a big impact on the index overall because these companies are very influential within the index. If you think about just like a pie chart, which represents the value of the S&P index, the bigger slices of pie are the bigger companies, and so their valuations and their fluctuations in value are going to have an outsized impact on the value of the index or the price of the index, whatever you want to call the number. And as companies increase and shrink, their market cap, their weighting within the index changes. It's something that changes every day. And so when you run an index fund, you have to constantly rebalance your fund, buying and selling shares of different companies as they're going down, so that you make sure that your index fund is weighted the same as the index itself. And so in effect, what that means is that as companies are increasing value, they're growing they're growing, their weight within the index grows. And so let's say, I don't know, let's take an example of Netflix. Netflix, let's say one day it made up 5% of the S&P. That was its weighting. And over the course of a year, it increases in value by some amount. Its weighting goes up to, let's say, 8%. Well, if you run an index fund, you're going to have to make sure that you rebalance your fund so that your fund has an 8% allocation in Netflix, even though, a year ago or whatever, you had a 5% allocation. As the value has gone up, you needed to rebalance to make sure that your allocations match the weighting within the index. And so as Twitter's price has been rising recently, with Elon purchasing all of this stock and talking about buying Twitter outright and taking it private, that has bid up the price of Twitter, because all these people, you have all these speculators going in and buying Twitter stock so that they can essentially flip it to Elon for more money. That's why, when you hear rumors about this, it's that somebody wants to buy a company, people rush in and buy the stock. And so it's possible, and I haven't checked this. I don't know an easy place where it would be to check, but it's just intuitively would make sense that Twitter's weighting within NASDAQ or the S&P, I'm not sure where it's listed or what indexes. It might be a part of both. I believe there's a lot of companies, especially tech companies, that are part of both the S&P and the NASDAQ. Twitter, as its price has increased, its weighting within those indexes or indices probably has increased slightly. And so the big three asset managers, Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock, that run the index funds, have probably had to increase their allocations in their index funds of Twitter stock. They've had to buy more Twitter stock. And so all this is to say, the news that broke a couple hours ago, which I hinted at earlier, which was that Vanguard has now overtaken Elon Musk as the largest shareholder in Twitter. People are looking at it and going, look, the regime, it feels threatened, and so they had to buy, more shares so that they were bigger than Elon. Because they're afraid of Elon owning 9% of Twitter. Well, I agree with that sentiment. I do obviously think that what Elon is doing is a major threat to the regime and to the censorship that has been in effect and been increasing ever since really 2016. I do think that it is possible that Vanguard, which is the largest asset manager, I believe, so their index funds are the biggest. It might be that just through simple portfolio rebalancing, they have had to up their allocation of Twitter and therefore purchase more Twitter stock, and that has pushed them over the edge. Now, I say that I'm speculating, but quite a bit just based off of my my knowledge of how these things work. It could entirely be just that Vanguard, wants to buy more than Elon Musk because, they're trying to, cut him off at the pass or something like that. But I don't know what Vanguard's allocation of Twitter was before. I don't know what percentage of Twitter they owned. Now they own slightly above 10%. Who knows how much they owned before? I don't. I'm sure you can look that up. I just didn't take the time. All I want to say is that it's not necessarily what you think, and that's not a defense of Vanguard. It's just that these asset management is a very complicated business. And so I thought it might be useful to give some insight into how that works and why, what you see on paper there or on your terminal. Although if you have a Bloomberg terminal, you know what I didn't teach you anything today. But what you see on the screen there when you see the headline, Vanguard overtakes Elon Musk as the largest shareholder in Twitter, I just want you to, think about what that means a little bit. It's not necessarily something sinister, although I do think that they're sinister agents. And so with that said, getting back to Twitter's bid, the big three asset managers are going to have a lot to say about this. Vanguard, obviously now, as I just said, is the largest shareholder in Twitter. State Street and BlackRock I did not see in the top 5, but I'm sure they're up there. Because, again, these are the big three asset managers. They run these index funds. They have to own Twitter. They have to own every other stock. And so they exercise an outsized influence over every company that is publicly traded in America. And they have made it clear that they are all in on ESG, and, they are woke capital. They're the definition of woke capital. That's what the big three are. And so for social reasons, for social justice reasons, they're going to have to stand strongly against Elon Musk, even though that might violate their fiduciary responsibility to their clients, which, as a financial advisor, your fiduciary responsibility is basically to do everything you can to try and maximize the returns of your client. Something to that effect. I'm sure it's not worded like that exactly, but that's what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to make decisions knowing that they are not in your client's best, financial best interest. And considering that Elon is making a very, very generous offer, I think that it would be very difficult for the big three asset managers to make the case that it's in their client's best interest for them not to support Elon's buyout. Now, it's not impossible for them to justify that. But let's just say it's not the obvious decision to make. And they would be opening themselves up potentially to SEC complaints or lawsuits from their investors, from individual people who felt that Vanguard, BlackRock, or State Street were not acting in their financial best interest and were rather acting for political reasons to thwart Elon's takeover, even though the clients of the big three, who are the real shareholders here, individual investors, the big three are just managing their shares in Twitter and all these other companies on their behalf. They could, in theory, get into trouble for that. But in practice, they're doing this to support the regime. They're trying to thwart Elon to support the regime, to support censorship. And so, given that, would the SEC, which is an arm of the regime, go after them? I think not. I think it just doesn't make sense. That just wouldn't make sense. One part of the regime is not going to go after a regime cutout, i.e., the big three asset managers. They are a cutout for the the regime in Washington and the Western, globalist World Economic Forum maelstrom. It might not even be the right term, actually, but that's what came to mind. But the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, it's an arm of the U.S. federal government. They are a part of the regime, de jure. Wall Street, of course, is part of the regime de facto. There is no de jure connection between government, Wall Street, and big corporate power, but we all understand that it exists and that these interests are aligned and that they're people argue over are corporations captured by the government or is government captured by corporations? It doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, they're both ruled by the same people. Corporations and government run by the same people. They have the same interests. They have the same goals. They're the same class. That's all it is. They are the power elite, as Murray Rothbard called them and many other people call them. That's the most accurate term. They are elite people who have power over us. Doesn't matter whether you want to call them, the state or, corporate overlords. They're the same people working towards the same ends. They have the same goals. They coordinate with one another. And so you can't expect the SEC to go after asset managers for, violating their fiduciary responsibility for the sake of furthering the goals of the regime. Now, with that said, am I a Musk bro? No. Do I like Teslas? No, I actually don't. I don't think they're attractive cars at all. I don't like electric cars. They're not fun for me. They're quite boring. I don't like that they spontaneously combust. I don't like the technology. I really think that it's incredibly unsustainable. I mean, they're cool in an isolated sense, but as far as mass market is concerned, it's ridiculous. You know how I feel about lithium-ion batteries and the way that they're produced, the resources that are needed to go into them, the lack of recyclability. I don't need to get into all that, and that's what Musk is all about. Musk is Mr. Electric Car. So I don't need to make the case, I don't think, any further even than that, even though I could, that I'm not a Musk bro. I'm not somebody who trusts Elon Musk. I don't think that he has my best interests at heart. I don't think that he's, necessarily Captain Red Pill. But with that said, the people who I know are my enemy clearly feel threatened by him. They clearly feel like Elon would be far too kind to me. And as long as that's the case, I have to say he'd be better than the existing people, at the very least. He might be substantially better. I don't know how free speech Elon is. I mean, old school Twitter was pretty darn free speech. I was there in the earlier days, the pre 2016 days, which actually weren't that long ago in the grand scheme of Twitter history. Twitter started like in 06. I think I started on Twitter in like 13. I didn't use it much until like the run up to the 2016 election. I think 2015 I started using Twitter more. And, it was just a wonderful free speech hellhole where there were all sorts of awful people and people who, believed anything and everything, and people who had all sorts of interests. It was the internet's stream of consciousness, because there was no organization on Twitter. It was just everything it was every idea in the world filtered through or pushed through an extremely tiny straw. And so it all came spewing out onto your timeline in a mess. And I think Elon, at the very least, remembers those days. I think that Elon is, I would say, compared to Jack, and remember, when Jack was really in charge of Twitter, Twitter was a good place. It's as he lost influence and became a figurehead that Twitter began to suck and was just amalgamated into, the empire. I think that Jack regrets that. I think that Jack is still a very naive guy. Was naive back then. Musk, I think, is less naive. Significantly less naive. And at the very least, he might not share my views on things. He remembers what Twitter was, and he wants to bring it back. And that, to me, as a longtime user, that's enough for me to support him. Musk does not have to be, down, as the kids would say, with everything that I'm about. But if he believes that I have a right to exist, and he wants to rebuild Twitter into what it was, which was a platform for any and all speech, for all the ideas in the world, then I welcome that. Because people have been talking about, oh, well, we have to build our own platforms and blah, blah, blah. And that just gets people into more and more echo chambers. What was cool about Twitter is that everybody was there. And I don't mean everybody in terms of, all people in the world. There's always been very few people on Twitter compared to mass social media sites like Facebook and Instagram. What was cool about Twitter was there were people from all walks of life and all different ideas. There were communities on Twitter of all these different people, and they could go and fight each other. It was, Mos Eisley Spaceport of the front side of the internet. You know what I mean? It wasn't like the dark side of the internet. It wasn't the dark web. It wasn't anything too nuts. But as far as standard internet stuff is concerned, Twitter was where everything overlapped. And some people, they would feel more comfortable in an echo chamber. They want to have, Twitter for conservatives or Twitter for woke purple-haired people. But I liked having Twitter for everybody. it was fun. It was a weird, sense of community. And that's mostly lost these days because, the right has been so thoroughly purged from Twitter. But some of us are still there. Those of us who don't say a whole lot are still there. It's the people who really were the good tweeters on the right who are gone. I think back to just people who were good at Twitter. I mean, I guess Michael Malice is still there, but I mean, Milo Yiannopoulos, people remember him as, doing provocative things, IRL, but I always thought he was just good at tweeting. And obviously, Medicare's been banned a few times. He's still on there, sort of. There was Peter Cozy. There's countless people that I've forgotten by this point. I mean, personal friends that I have on Twitter, Twitter mutuals, that sort of thing. And by having all these different people, different ideas in the same place, people were exposed to one another. They were exposed to different ideas, even if they were in the most toxic form possible. It was still a cross-pollination. And that's something that I think humanity in general needs. So, with that said, Musk has my support. I don't want to say full support because I do agree with him that taking Twitter private is probably the only way to really get it back to where it was. Because being a publicly traded company, the restrictions on it. I'll put it this way: if I had a company, I would never take it public. It's just a nightmare. There's too much. There's a lot of details to get into. I don't want to get why. And it's not just about quarterly reportings and things like that. And of course, the fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders to maximize profits, which very quickly is becoming a consumer or a fiduciary responsibility to maximize social justice. They're trying to redefine the fiduciary responsibility to include ESG, which would be a part of the defense of the big three if they were ever sued over rejecting Elon's offer, if they do that. So with all that said, I hope he succeeds, and I will see you folks back here tomorrow.